The lessons learned during Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Harvey were many. Uh, Probably the most important of which was preparedness. Family preparedness, community preparedness, political preparedness, response preparedness. I mean, one can never be too prepared. A lot of the failures that occur during hurricane disasters, and these two storms illustrate that, are folks that either are not prepared or they fail to plan, and they realize at the last moment that there is a storm bearing down upon them. They have not decided whether to evacuate or not, or they've ignored evacuation warnings, and then the responders have to evacuate them. So it causes a lot of unnecessary clogging of highways. Shelters are ill-equipped to handle them because they either weren't forecasted to have as many evacuees as they thought they would have, or they just decide they're going to leave the state, and it creates a lot of issues. All the branches in disaster preparedness and hurricane response are important. You cannot say one is more critical or more important than the other. They're all equal. They're co-equal. There is as much effort in mitigation and planning as there is in response and recovery. If a community is not prepared for a storm, which means they've identified flood zone or flood prone areas, they've identified areas that require evacuation, they have identified where there are going to be bottlenecks when evacuations occur, that's all in mitigation and preparedness. They go through these phases. When the storm hits, the actual response side of it is important, and that's the one also, by the way, that garners most of the attention. I mean, if you think about what we see when we watch the news and we see a hurricane striking, what's your picture? Well, you picture the winds, the reporters standing out in the winds, leaning into it with the rain pelting them in the face. That's the vision that people have of hurricanes. So that gets the most attention. But there is as much critical importance to mitigation and planning and preparedness and response as there is to recovery, because recovery is a long-term effort. The important thing about lessons learned is that one has to remember that disasters typically can occur anywhere, anytime, as we see on TV daily, essentially. But emergency managers work in primarily four realms of readiness or involvement, that cover mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And in those four phases that we call them, and there are also others that fall within that too in terms of effort, they're always looking for best practices. They're trying to figure out what worked, what didn't work. And we do that through critiques. We do that through what's called post-incident analyses, where responders or planners, whomever is involved in a disaster effort, will sit back and identify what worked, what didn't work. And you see this through all levels of government. Hurricane preparedness is everyone's business, first of all. I will tell you that. To say that only states that are around the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic coast have to worry about hurricanes really isn't accurate, because storms move inland. Plus don't forget we have storms also in the Pacific that can come up the Yucatan Peninsula and come up through Southern California, as we've seen, and dump a lot of rain in the mountains that causes flash flooding, that causes mudslides. We have to remember that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, like any agency, learns from lessons that have occurred from past disasters. FEMA, in my mind, should really get a gold star for what they have done in terms of planning and preparedness and for funding. And remembering that FEMA is not the primary response entity. Your local emergency managers are through either local mutual aid or state mutual aid or mutual aid compacts from state to state. They're your primary response folks. FEMA provides mainly the logistic support, the planning, and the money. In a disaster, when a local emergency is prepared by local political entities, the governor declares a state of emergency, then the governor can make the request to the president for a federal declaration. Well, I think it's important for us to realize that mitigation is ongoing. Mitigation really necessarily starts and ends. One is always in a mitigation phase, in that you're planning, you're building infrastructure, you're identifying, areas that one has to be concerned about. The whole concept of a Category 5 going to Miami, and when it's too late to start mitigating, even that sentence in and of itself says you're too late. Remembering that one is always in that cycle, those four phases of emergency management, and mitigation is one of the phases, but one is also always doing some form of mitigating, whether they're actually out, building a levee, or they're identifying maybe where breakwater should be put in because, the bay. There's a lot of things that, that planners have to consider.